Hello and welcome! It's finally time for the alchemy video for Magnus Protocol. Couple quick things we need to get out of the way though. First and foremost, I am not an expert on alchemy. All of this is my own personal research. I have not sat in on courses or anything like that. I don't have a doctorate. I am not a teacher or any version professor, anything like that. I am just somebody that loves Magnus and dug into all this stuff. There are also aspects that I did not fully dive into, or else this video would have probably not come out until next year. The big one being astrology. And so if you're somebody out there that is an astrologist, I know very little about astrology. So, you know, there's going to be a little bit of it in this video, but we're not going to get deep into the astrology side of it. If you are someone that loves astrology, I personally would love to have you make a video that gets into the sides of alchemy with astrology, because even though I did dedicate time for some research into that, I don't understand the nitty-gritty of astrology, and so I don't feel like that would have been conducive to this video. But I will bring up astrology whenever it does factor in. And also, alchemy has been used for some great things, especially when it comes to chemistry. It's also been used for some horrible things. Now, that can be said for just about anything. I've said it a couple times in some of these videos. I'm a Christian. Christianity has definitely been used by a lot of people for some terrible things. So, you know, don't take this as me just saying, hey, alchemy's forever, you know, terrible. It's how could they even use it in Magnus? But at the same time, alchemy does have some pretty dark stuff attached to it. So don't take this as a primer for how to get into alchemy, because some roads of alchemy will lead you some very, very bad things. We're going to get into that as we get into the history of alchemy. But all that said, please remember that this entire purpose is not just to talk about alchemy. It's to talk about alchemy and how it could be used and has been used in the Magnus Protocol. So, again, this is not a primer. This is not a, hey, check this out to learn how to practice alchemy today. That is not the purpose of this video. I'm not the right person to do that. But I'm excited to talk about this, and this whole thing has shown me where I need to grow as a person in my studying efforts, where I was lacking, and has shown me that I am not qualified to dig into as much detail as I tried to. So I'm going to do my best here, and I'm very sorry if I let you down. Because of all that, there's probably going to be a lot more cuts in this video than usual, but we're going to get into it. We're going to have a great time, and hopefully this can help you. There will be timestamps in the description and in a pinned comment, just in case there's a section you don't personally care about, like when we get into the history. But like I said, any of this could be used for Magnus Protocol, and I'm excited to see if it is. So let's just get into it. I think we've given enough of a prior statement. Let's go. What is alchemy? Well, alchemy is a lot of things. Depending on where and when you were and the school of alchemy that you were trained in, or that you chose to follow, or that you chose to start, you could be creating stones to try and cure disease, to try and find immortality, to transmute metals, or even summon demons and bind them to objects to steal people's souls. Despite all these schools of thought being so separate and secretive, there are a few things that were common throughout all of them. Transmutation of metals, minerals, compounds, chemicals, and of self. The crafting of a panacea that could cure any disease, and creating the elixir of immortality. These things exist in almost all the schools of alchemy in different ways. The goal was the great work, or the magnum opus. This would be to create the Philosopher's Stone, to perfect the human, both mind, soul, body, right? Some of those only use body and soul. Some of them use the mind as well as a separate thing that has to be worked with. Sometimes the mind and the soul are used together, you know. The pinnacle of this work, of course, would lead to the Philosopher's Stone, that would allow the alchemist to turn lead or any other material into gold, as well as to fulfill all the other desires of the alchemist, to be immortal, to cure disease, to be unaging. These aspects of alchemy have led to quite a divide of opinion, as the focus on the body led to much of our current day chemistry and medicine. And there's some really wonderful things that have come for that. I talked about that when we talked about Robert Boyle and Robert Hooke in Magnus Protocol. I believe it was Episode 19. I just double checked. Episode 19. However, the focus on the soul has led to many ties with esotericism, hermeticism, Gnosticism, mysticism, Kabbalah, astrology, and the occult, as well as many, many more, Rosicrucianism. It's a lot. When I tell you it was a lot of research, I mean it. I am using a script for this video. Probably should have said that before, but I'm going to try and make it less dry as we go through, so you will have some deviations from the script, but I will go back through this video later and cut any sections that I found that I said something that was just flat wrong. I don't think that'll happen, but, you know, just know if there's a cut. I either had a coughing fit, stopped to get a drink from my coffee, or said something wrong. One of the three. Let's go for a quick jaunt through history of alchemy real quick. And if you don't care about the history of alchemy, you can follow the timestamp that's going to be on screen right here. But the reason for this is because any of these names could be used, any of this information could be used, and some of them already have been in Magnus Protocol. So we're going to take this little jaunt, as it were. This little, it's going to be very dry. I'm going to do my best. But it's also kind of fascinating. The study of alchemy is said to have come from Hermes Trismegistus, which also is the beginning of Hermeticism. These two are tied in many ways, but may not have always been. Alchemy historically can be traced back to many sources, and as such, alchemy has many schools and doctrines. First, let's cover the Hellenistic Egyptian alchemy, focused around goldsmithing and metallurgy, as well as the gods of Egypt, according to Zosimos of Panopolis. Again, we're going to say a lot of names in here. If you are somebody that wants to, or that already does take notes for Magnus Protocol or even Magnus Archives, I would recommend writing some of these names down. You'll see them in the captions down below, so it's not like you can't, discern the spelling of them. But these are people that I think have a very high likelihood of either showing up or being referenced in Magnus, and I will highlight them as we go. I have a short list later on, but Hermes Trismegistus, the father of Hermeticism, and Zosimos of Panopolis, two big names to remember. Zosimos was sure alchemy was practiced in Pharaonic Egypt, which would have been before the Hellenistic period, and focused on Thoth, or Thoth, depending on how it's said. Different people pronounce it differently. Also known as Hermes Trismegistus. So we have the man, Hermes Trismegistus, that we're pretty sure existed, and then we have Thoth, the Egyptian god, which many believe, Zosimos was one of them, to actually be Hermes Trismegistus before he revealed himself as Hermes Trismegistus. Again, it's going to get deep. Just bear with me here. There's some really cool stuff in here that I think is going to be applicable to Magnus in quite a few ways. And just a couple quick things on Thoth, the Egyptian god. Here it's the Egyptian god of the moon, which is going to be important later. Also the Egyptian god of knowledge, science, and magic. So, those things could be important. The feminine counterpart was Seshat. And so just, things that might matter later, knowing that Hermes Trismegistus and Thoth are tied in the history of alchemy, and also that the moon is involved, and magic, and knowledge. Just throwing that out there. Might be something to remember. A lot of Zosimos' writings have been destroyed. The burning of Alexandria is where a lot of them were believed to be, including a lot of the older things that he claims would have existed from earlier Egyptian alchemy, but the writings that did survive went on to be the root of Greek and European alchemy. Most interestingly, these writings focus mainly on the physical aspects of alchemy, the recipes for dyes, making artificial gems or pearls, how to make imitation gold or silver. I think too often, this is just a quick Trey aside, I think too often we forget how skilled people in history actually were, and it's pretty crazy that they had recipes for all this back in Zosimos' day. Either way, Greek alchemy went on to theorize that all matter was formed of 4 elements: earth, air, water, and fire. Later, ether was added, as well as the qualities of life being hotness, coldness, dryness, moistness, and all of those things tended to add in some more hermeticism to Greek alchemy, which we're going to get into Greek alchemy in just a minute, but it was very inspired from Egyptian alchemy, and specifically a lot of the writings of Zosimos and of Hermes Trismegistus. So just, again, those names are going to be important. We're going to get back to the elements and to hotness, coldness, dryness, moistness. That's going to come back later, but for now, let's get into Rome. When Rome fell, Khalid ibn Yazid brought this alchemy to Islam, and there we get Jabir ibn Hayyan, who is also known as Geber. And this is another one of those, like, hey, if you're going to write anybody's name down, write down Geber's name. Jabir, that is Jabir ibn Hayyan, would anchor alchemy back to a balance between the theoretical and the practical in the Middle East. Eleazar Paul Krauss, a fascinating guy in and of himself, has nothing to do with alchemy, but just fascinating guy. He was a notable Arabist. He wrote, "The study of the Greek alchemists is not very encouraging. An even surface examination of the Greek test shows that a very small part only was organized according to true experiments of laboratory. Even the supposedly technical writings, in the state where we find them today, are unintelligible nonsense, which refuses any interpretation. It is different with Jabir's alchemy. The relatively clear description of the processes and the alchemical apparati, the methodical classification of the substances, mark an experimental spirit, which is extremely far away from the weird and odd esotericism of the Greek text. The theory on which Jabir supports his questions is one of clearness and of impressive unity. More than with the other Arab authors, one notes with him a balance between theoretical teaching and practical teaching, between the ilm and the amal. In vain one would seek in the Greek text a work as systematic as that which is presented, for example, in the Book of 70, which was written by Jabir ibn Hayyan, or Geber. Geber did not completely abandon alchemical hermeticism, though, because his goal was to create artificial life. Geber would add sulfur and mercury to the classical elements. Later on, he added salt as well, because he believed that Aristotle was onto something with the earth, air, water, and fire, and that the metals of the earth each contained all four of the basic qualities of life, that is, hotness, coldness, dryness, moistness, and two of those being interior, two of those being exterior. He believed that if you could rearrange those qualities, it would become a different metal. And because of that, the search for the Philosopher's Stone in Middle Eastern alchemy was born. And that spread, right? That idea of you could take the two interior and the two exterior qualities and you could reverse them, whether the earth, air, water, fire, or the hotness, coldness, dryness, moistness, and you could flip them or subvert them or change them or transmute them, and through that process you would change the chemical properties of a metal. And of course, we're going to get more into the Philosopher's Stone later, but it's a mythical and theoretical stone that was not a stone, that would allow you to transmute any metal into another, and in some teaching would allow you to transmute any matter into another. Now that we've covered the Middle Eastern alchemy, though, let's dive back towards Egypt to cover the rest of Grecian alchemy, because there's quite a bit to dig into here. We're going to cover it again a little bit more when we get to European alchemy, because a lot of the alchemy that is spread throughout the world came from Egypt and then later Greece. You have people like Plato and Aristotle. I mentioned earlier with Geber that Aristotle was the one that said earth, air, water, fire, and later ether would come as well. Plato also was a fervent, ardent defender of this, that all life was made up of the basic elements, and if one could understand those elements, one could understand life. These are very influential philosophers. They were just more philosophizing, right? But in that, they sparked an idea, not just with Geber, as we saw a minute ago, but with many others that would come to follow. Specifically, one of the things that Aristotle taught that is kind of subverted in a lot of later alchemy is that earth, air, water, fire, those are not a physical thing as much as they are a spiritual thing. It is the state that all matter goes back to if left alone, that everything is made up of these building blocks. And it's kind of crazy when you think about it, how close they were to actually getting the building blocks of creation, right? Which are the cells and the atoms, right? The molecules. And it's crazy that they were on the right track there. But because of that, we were able to get a lot of what we have today. So, again, great philosophers that dabbled in some things, especially like Plato, that get a little esoteric, is maybe the word. But we'll get into some more of that later when we start getting into people like Crowley. Also, with the Greeks, there were people like Lactantius that tried to mix Christianity and alchemy, and that's where, if you remember in episode 19, when I talk about Robert Boyle and Robert Hooke and good science, that's where that idea comes from, is taking the aspects of alchemy that you want to use for science and still trying to claim that they come from a creator. Instead of Hermes Trismegistus or Thoth, It could be God, right? The Christian God. It could be somebody else, depending on where you're getting your information from and where you're taught, or if you're trying to twist it. And though Lactantius did try to get that movement going, it was shut down by a few people, specifically St. Augustine shut it down and said that Hermes Trismegistus was an idolater. So, there's been some back and forth on that for many, many years. Every once in a while, it'll get a push again, and then it gets pushed back down again. It is going to be more applicable, I think, when we get to European alchemy, but I did want to mention that because Christianity is far from the only religion that has ties back into alchemy throughout the years. But I also wanted to mention in the Greeks, there's some really interesting people that we don't know their real names, but they use pseudonyms. These are people that called themselves Moses or Cleopatra, and almost assuredly were not those people, right? But because of their writings under those pseudonyms, there are those that say, well, yeah, Moses from the Old Testament of the Bible, he was an alchemist. Cleopatra, she was an alchemist. Look, I'm going to tell you right now, we're going to get into it later. Alchemy is so secretive, it's hard to nail down anybody as an alchemist, right? Any of the people that we have written in this list here might not have even been alchemists, and somebody might have just used their name. But with that kind of funny idea, let's move on to Rasayana, which is Indian alchemy. It focused primarily on medicine, perfumes, and explosives, which is cool. The goal was to create a divine body and a physical immortality. All of this was built around, and I'm so sorry if I mispronounce these. I did look up how to pronounce them. Rasa, Mercury, and Nagarjuna Sita was said to be able to convert mercury into gold. Early alchemical writings have ties to Kaula and Masindranath, though later works seem to focus more on the medicinal and physical aspects than the spiritual. Let's also jump over to Chinese alchemy, because it's a lot like Rasayana in that it focuses more on medicine and the search for the grand elixir of immortality instead of the Philosopher's Stone. Like before, though, that doesn't mean they gave up completely on Hermeticism. Gihong theorized in his book Inner Chapters of the Book of the Master, who embraces spontaneous nature, that alchemical elixirs were better than medicine because they protected the spirit as well as healing the body. Nadan was a teaching of internal alchemy focused on nourishing the inner gods through meditation. Unfortunately, some took it to the extreme, and some Taoists ate mercuric sulfide, believing death through it would lead them to the Taoist heavens. There's a lot of stuff in Chinese alchemy specifically about different medicinal properties. Mercury wound up killing the first king of Qin, the Qin dynasty, because they believed it was a medicine that would give him, immortality. So there's a lot of that, and from those lessons, of course, we learned a lot about how mercury works and mercury poisoning, mercury sulfide, and things like that. But unfortunately, there were lives lost in the process of it. This all leads us to European, sometimes called medieval alchemy, which has a ton of important translators that brought in Middle Eastern alchemy, some of which are Gerard of Cremona and Adelard of Bath. That's a name that, might sound familiar. I don't think it has any ties to Adelard Decker from Magnus Archives, but you never know. They could bring him back. Also, I got distracted with Adelard, sorry. Avicenna, Muhammad ibn Zachariah al-Razi, and Robert of Chester, which is kind of an important one, who translated the Liber de Compositione Alchimiae from an Arabic work many think was written by Khalid ibn Yazid. And again, if Khalid is familiar, Samama Khalid, where there's a lot of ties. Every main character, their last name, ties in somehow to an alchemist. I feel like that's important. Albertus Magnus, kind of an important name. And Roger Bacon brought in the Greek teachings, and Albertus Magnus, his student, St. Thomas Aquinas, and Roger Bacon all wound up with myths and legends about how deep into alchemy the three of them truly delved, with some saying Albertus Magnus, the thrice great, had created the Philosopher's Stone and passed it down to his pupil. Now, before we get any further into this, there are some wonderful legends and myths about these three men, about a lot of the other names that I mentioned earlier too. Unfortunately, a lot of the ones about Thomas Aquinas and Albertus Magnus are probably not true. as we're going to get into, but that does not mean they can't be used in Magnus Protocol. And I should say again here, I mentioned it the last time that Albertus Magnus came up in Protocol, that I am a huge fan of the writings of Thomas Aquinas. There is some really great wisdom that he wrote down that unfortunately has been twisted by a lot of people, as it always has been. Anytime you have somebody say something really smart, right, that can mean a lot of things, people are going to take it and twist it to their own ideologies, unfortunately. But I really like Thomas Aquinas. I think that there's some really cool stuff he said, and that has nothing to do with this. So let's get back into this. If Albertus Magnus gave a Philosopher's Stone to Thomas Aquinas, there's a small problem here, because it would require some great deception, as Thomas Aquinas died 6 years before Albertus Magnus, and Albertus Magnus was on the record saying that he had witnessed the transmutation of gold with his own eyes, but we don't know if that means he did it or if he saw somebody else do it. Was he lying to try and help a friend, or did he actually see it? That's where a lot of the myths come from. But again, he can't have created a Philosopher's Stone, died in the process of it, and sent it to his student, because Thomas Aquinas died first. A lot of people believe that Albertus Magnus gave up his life in the creation of that Philosopher's Stone, and it was his very soul that he used as the Prima Materia, and that's why it would be passed down to Thomas Aquinas. But again, it doesn't line up timeline-wise. That doesn't mean it couldn't line up in the Magnus universe, though. So just, something to think about. I mentioned Roger Bacon earlier, too. Bacon was a scholar who wrote the great work, the Opus Majus, and believed the practical side of alchemy proved the theoretical side. Legend has him become an archmage of considerable ability. Both him and Albertus Magnus supposedly made bronze heads that could speak, which is okay. Now, depending on your school of alchemy, they either did that through taking and making new life, or from binding demons to it. So might not be quite as fun as you would believe, but depending, it could be really cool. And for what it's worth, I don't know, man, just bronze heads that could just start talking to you. That's kind of fun. Alchemy was attempted to be reconciled with Christianity again in the Middle Ages by Saint Anselm of Canterbury, Peter Abelard, and Robert Grosseteste, and was then widely accepted among many Europeans. It was not in secret anymore, technically. There was still a lot of secret being done around it. However, this attempt was championed by Pseudo-Geber, not the first Geber, a new Geber, who taught that alchemy was the bridge between man and God, and that by purifying gold, one could then purify the soul, which would allow man to be reunited with God, which is kind of antithetical to the teachings of the Bible and led to a lot of outspoken voices trying to shout him down, specifically Dante, who wrote Dante's Inferno, Piers Plowman, and Geoffrey Chaucer, as well as Nicholas Amaric of the Inquisition, who wrote that alchemy included demonic rituals. Now, absolutely, there were some alchemists using demonic rituals, but not all of them, right? However, once word got out from the Inquisition that, hey, demonic rituals are being done in alchemy, that was kind of the nail in the coffin for a lot of people in this time period. There are a few more notable people we need to mention as alchemy turns from trying to be good and Christian to more widely accepting that esotericism that it was rooted in. The idea of a Homeric chain of wise men that leaked heaven and earth was reputed around this time. Basically, that from Homer, again, a lot of Greeks involved in alchemy, from Homer, there were people that had been given the wisdom from Hermes Trismegistus all the way down to now in the Middle Ages, and that they were the ones to listen to, right? It almost feels like, with alchemy refuted by the church, that they went, all right, well, let's dive fully back into the other, and this led to some really cool things that they found and some not cool things. But a couple things I wanted to mention there is it's crazy, and in my research for this, we're spending way too long in the history. I'm so sorry. In my research for this, it was crazy how many super important people in history wound up having ties. Even like Dante wound up having ties to alchemy. Now, Dante wasn't an alchemist, but he was outspoken against alchemy. And I just think it's weird to have so many people be involved with this thing that I barely knew anything about. So many people that throughout history I've studied over the years that I just never knew were tied into this, you know? And I think that's really nifty. Anyway, no more of that, and on to more of this. Nicholas Flamel was supposedly an alchemist of rare talent in this time. Though whether he was actually an alchemist, whether he was actually a person, is still kind of up in the air. But supposedly he was able to make a Philosopher's Stone, and his wife was also apparently a very, very good alchemist. And they are some of those that are considered to have become immortal and maybe still walk the earth today because they were able to create a Philosopher's Stone. Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa combined Kabbalah with Hermeticism and alchemy, which quickly spread and became the new version of alchemy for many. However, Paracelsus, this is such a long name, Philippus Aureolus Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim took a different approach, taking from alchemy what was useful for medicine and focusing only on that to the exclusion of the esoteric. Now, when I say that, Hohenheim, Paracelsus, was incredibly important in the process of trying to make a homunculus. Please don't misunderstand that to mean that he didn't do any of the weird... There's a gnat. That he didn't do any of the stranger side of alchemy, but he specifically was trying to focus on the medicine side and cut out the esoteric. On the other side of that, we have John Dee, who, if you've never heard of him, you really should look into him. I would be very surprised if he doesn't come up at some point in Protocol. A man so given to the occult that he dabbled in every school of thought he could find. He studied all of them. He believed you could summon angels as well as demons, and that the Philosopher's Stone would let him speak to both, as well as speak the language of God. Dee had written down many correspondences with these angels, though it's been argued by many that he was the unwilling pawn of demons or some other fell spirit who lied to him. Some people believed that it was even the Fae that he talked to, and there are going to be some other ties to the Fae later, which is really interesting. And that he was just deceived the whole time into thinking he was talking to angels. The common European belief at the time was that John Dee thought he was talking to angels, but was actually talking to fallen angels, and that would be demons. Let me mention, too, when I say common belief at the time, I don't mean at the time of his life. John Dee was a very secretive man and was in a lot of secret societies and was kind of a spy, but after his death, all these things were found in his house. Not all of them have been fully translated today because of codes and ciphers, but he is a fascinating man. Now, Dee believed, and was believed to be, a magician of some great skill, being able to scry great distances and do a lot of other smaller, more mundane magics, but he was also a good friend of a man named Edward Kelley. Kelley being a name that is kind of important. It's Lena's last name. Yet again, all these ties, you know. But also, Edward Kelley was renowned as a mage. Some call him even an archmage, right? He was believed to be a sorcerer in many ways. And he believed that viewing these creatures through a mirror or a glass stone, that he could see and communicate with these angels who promised him great secrets, including not just of the universe, but also, if he could summon them, how to make a Philosopher's Stone, which sounds to me like a Faustian bargain of, hey, yeah, if you'll summon me, I'll teach you how to make this thing. I'm definitely not going to try and kill you afterwards. Regardless, because of the fame and the things they were purported to do, talking about John Dee, Edward Kelley, as well as some others, alchemy turned again to be seen as more supernatural instead of medicinal, which again, it mostly started as supernatural back in Egypt and became medicinal later on, but regardless, eventually Robert Boyle laid the groundwork that would finally separate alchemy and chemistry, and that would lead us to what we have today, which is that alchemy is mostly an esoteric or occult practice, right? Robert Boyle, kind of important again. We talked about him in Protocol, in the reviews. He believed in good science, which would use the things of alchemy to further the cause of science. But also, there's a lot more about him that is kind of important. We're going to get to it a little bit. And he's not the only one. So, Mary Ann Atwood and Ethan Allen Hitchcock spoke out against the separation of alchemy and chemistry, and others joined them. there were quite a few that believed that the two could not be separated, and that the spiritualism of alchemy was required to be able to understand the scientific side of alchemy, because whatever you were doing with a material or a metal, you needed to be able to do with yourself and your soul as well. Now, we're getting long in the tooth here, and we need to get into the rest of the aspects of alchemy. This is going to be such a long video, but it's going to be what it's going to be, because we're almost done with the history, and I do think this stuff is still important. Now, it would be remiss of me to talk about alchemy and its history without talking about the Royal Society. The Royal Society of London for Improving Natural Knowledge, later known simply as the Royal Society, was founded on the 28th of November in the year 1660, though it's believed by some that fellows of the society, like Robert Boyle, were members of the Invisible College before the foundation of the Royal Society. Among their study of the sciences, the Invisible College studied alchemy and sought a centralized center for the exchange of information. This would be very different than what was happening before with alchemy, where everyone studied on their own or would maybe team up with a couple other people. But for the most part, all alchemists were individual. They would read each other's works, but they all thought they were going to be the one to find the Philosopher's Stone or create the Philosopher's Stone, depending. The Royal Society was formed for a study of new science, or good science, as we mentioned a couple times, which focused on using the scientific method to further society. King Charles II approved, and a royal charter was signed in 1662, with William Brockner being the first president, and Robert Hooke, again important, from Magnus. He's the one that suggested that they burn down London. We're assuming that's what he suggested, to be able to stop Isaac Newton's alchemy, appointed as curator of experiments. The Royal Society offered something new, right? The aspect of being able to work together, but not just work together to sound out ideas in a place where others were not trying to steal your secrets, but were your fellows who would further your work alongside you. Some famous alchemists were fellows of the society, such as Robert Boyle, Isaac Newton, and James Price, who drank cyanide poisoning. It's a really, really long story, but it's a really interesting story. It does unfortunately end with a man's death. He believed, the very short version, we got to keep moving. The very short version is that he claimed to have been able to transmute gold out of other metals, and when he was called to account for it, said that he didn't have enough of the material left to be able to do it, and when the day came that he was supposed to have gotten more of the material, he drank cyanide poisoning. The Royal Society would move away from alchemy and astrology as chemistry and astronomy took to the fore, and that catches us up pretty much to today. A lot of history in alchemy, a lot of big names that could come up in Protocol, a lot of things that could be used, and it feels like in Protocol, the Magnus Institute took over for the Royal Society, right? You could be a member of the Royal Society, as we saw with Hooke and Boyle and Isaac Newton, but also, just to mention, Isaac Newton eventually became the president, which was really weird, of the Royal Society. Cool, but, you know. Anyway, it looks like the Institute took over there and might have been less observed, right? They might have had more freedom in the Institute. Anyway, now that the history's out of the way, and many of you skipped straight to this point, you missed some really fun stuff. It's not fun. I'm not going to get into that one. Anyway, now that the history is out of the way, let's tackle the main aspects of alchemy, breaking down the various methods thought to create a Philosopher's Stone, dig into the symbols and metals. This will not be all of the methods nor all of the ways, since most alchemists kept their teachings very secret. When I say secret, I mean ciphers, symbols, rhymes, and wordplay to confuse you, hidden basements, secret floors, hidden compartments. They were serious about keeping it secret, and they had to be, you know? These codes and tricks were all individual to the alchemist so that nobody else could stumble on it, because for one, you didn't want another alchemist to find your work and make the Philosopher's Stone instead of you. You wanted to be the one to do that. But also, if you figured it out and you wrote it down and somebody walked in off the street that didn't know what they were doing, not only would it be very dangerous for them to work with the chemicals, but it would also be very dangerous for them to have a Philosopher's Stone. You don't want to give some random person on the street immortality because you don't know how they're going to use it. You don't want to give them the ability to turn lead into gold because you don't know what they're going to do with it. So let's start with the magnum opus, the great work, Kinning's talks about that in Protocol, and that the alchemists are still seeking the great work, even in Protocol time. An alchemist would use the Prima Materia, or prime matter, and transmute it through the 4 stages to eventually become the Philosopher's Stone. The main problem with this is the Prima Materia itself. It's sometimes called quintessence and sometimes ether, but what is it? Well, it could be lead, or it could be tin, or it could be urine. It's everything. The purest of matter, which when in contact with an imperfect matter, makes that matter perfect. See, the real issue is that the Prima Materia isn't just one thing. It, like everything else, was kept secret. And so even the alchemist of the past that had claimed to have made a Philosopher's Stone did not write down what the Prima Materia is. Martin Rulin the Younger believed the philosophers have so greatly admired the creature of God, which is called the primal matter, especially concerning its efficacy and mystery, that they have given to it many names and almost every possible description, for they have not known how to sufficiently praise it. While others, like Arthur Edward Waite, taught that the true name of the Prima Materia was hidden. So, it could be that the Prima Materia is lead, but it could also be something else that was given the name lead so that no other alchemist would figure out what it is. And what this leads to is every alchemist having to try different materials. It is up to the alchemist to find this Prima Materia from among every material in existence, and once found and confirmed, to take it through the 4 stages. These 4 stages of transmutation are nigredo, or melanosis, albedo, or leucosis, citrinitas, or xanthosis, and rubedo, or iosis. I've talked about these a little bit. We're going to dig back into them here, just in case you haven't seen those other videos, and this is the only one you're seeing. Nigredo is the process by which materials are cleansed and cooked until they are putrefied. Not a word we use all the time, but it basically means just to make them decay. It also represents the dark night of the soul, where a soul confronts the shadow within themselves. Thomas Brown described Nigredo as being lost in the uncomfortable night of nothing, which obviously trends to the dark and the lonely as well as the end, but at the same time, Nigredo is that process of giving up who you used to be, right? Facing the darkness within yourself and moving forward. So again, these 4 stages can absolutely just be a chemical thing, but often they were also looked at as a personal thing, as a furthering of yourself, a transmutation of the soul, the process to become a new you, which ties in very well with where we are in Protocol. You can't just stay as you are. You need to transmute yourself. You need to change. Following Nigredo is albedo, or whiteness. Albedo is the process of purification, taking what was putrefied and washing away the impurities, known as eblutio. Through this purification, the Prima Materia is divided into 2 opposing parts that will be fused into a unity of opposites, or a coincidentia oppositorium in rubedo. An example of the unity of opposites is an inclined road, which goes both up and down at the same time, and neither prevent the other despite being diametrically opposed, which reminds me of the 2 halves of the brain. There's a lot of ties in here that are really fascinating and get me very excited. This albedo would be choosing to move past that darkness that you faced and finding the new tomorrow, right? Finding the fact that you are both what you used to be and what you could be at the same time, and neither of those 2 things stop the other. It's very interesting. Citrinitas, or the yellowing, is next, in which the solar light inherent in one's being awakens and dawns and leaves behind the lunar or soul light. That might not make much sense right now. It'll make a whole lot more sense later when we get into the sun and the moon, but it's basically the process of the yellowing, of giving the light and through the light moving forward, of taking what was and choosing to focus on what is instead of what was. Then lastly, we have rubedo, or the reddening, the finishing of the work, taking the 2 opposites and making them one in every way, a full, whole self. The process can take a long time. Rubedo, often you wouldn't know that you failed in making the Philosopher's Stone until after years, because rubedo was such a long process. Personally, I feel like a lot of alchemists probably gave up after the first 2 weeks of there not being any sign of reddening. But this is also why we feel like the Philosopher's Stone was red, because the final process would make a red stone out of the prime material that you put in there. A very poor example of the 4 stages, just to give you an idea of this, is asphalt. So nigredo, the asphalt is cooked and poured into the form. The asphalt is hot and chaos reigns. Albedo, the form is scraped clean. The asphalt is both up the incline and down the incline simultaneously. Citrinitas, the asphalt dries in the sunlight, setting and becoming firm in its new existence. And rubedo, the asphalt has become a road. The road goes up and down. There is no longer a contradiction in the road's eyes, for the road is reborn and has made peace with both up and down, for the road is made to be traveled, no matter the direction. Again, that's a really poor example, but that is the process by which a material would take. You would pick a material and you would move forward with it through these 4 steps and see if at the end of it you had the Philosopher's Stone. If you didn't, maybe you needed to add more steps, maybe you needed a different material, maybe you did something wrong somewhere, and so the testing would continue. Unfortunately, asphalt is not the Prima Materia, and the 4 stages are not the only stages. As I said a minute ago, you might need to add more stages. Some alchemists use some more. Some dropped it down to only 3, where instead of Citrinitas, they would just have Nigredo, Albedo, Rubedo. The Tabula Smaragdina, or the Emerald Tablet of Hermeticism, is one of many guides or recipes used to understand the stages. The Emerald Tablet was translated by many people, one of whom being Sir Isaac Newton, which is very interesting for where we're at in Protocol, and is where the phrase "as above, so below" comes from. You've probably heard that a lot. That was written by Hermes Trismegistus on the Emerald Tablet. The 4 stages remind me somewhat of the New You, and in some ways of the avatars in archives. These people that started as one thing and became something different. And then, as I mentioned, it also reminds me of the 2 halves of the brain. There are also the 12 stages, or gates, of George Ripley. Celia Ripley, again, just important names. And the 14 stages of Samuel Norton. And I've got those listed here. We're not going to dig super deep in them, but we'll list off the 14, the 7, and then the 12, because I do think they're pretty important. There's a lot of different ways, as I said, so we're going to start with the 12 gates of George Ripley, and then we'll go into the rest. These 12 gates, these 12 steps, are calcination, which is burning the material, solution or dissolution, which is to dissolve what remains from the burning, the ashes or anything like that, into water, liquid. Water is normally the main one, but it could be other liquids. Separation, to separate out what's useful from the dross. Conjunction, to combine the useful materials from the previous process. Putrefaction, to let it decay. Congelation, which is to let it crystallize. Cibation, which is to add in some more solution, some fresh material to be able to keep the experiment going. Sublimation, which is to raise or elevate the material. Fermentation, which is to let it finish decaying, and then the bacteria that would grow from it would give new life. Exaltation, which would be to heat it from the bottom so that it became a vapor and would be captured in the top, to then be able to be turned back into a solid by skipping the liquid phase. Fermentation, which is to let it finish decaying and the bacteria growing inside to be able to bring new life into it. Exaltation, which is to elevate it, to raise it. Multiplication, which would be, we're going to get into that later, it's very important, it would be to spread, not just to make more of it, but to spread the use of it. And then projection, which is the final confirmation of multiplication, and projection are the final confirmations that you've made of Philosopher's Stone. And we'll get into what those are in a little bit. But then we also have the 14 steps of Samuel Norton, which are purgation, again, to burn it, sublimation again, calcination, burn it again, exuberation, which no matter how hard I looked, I could not find a good definition for when it comes to alchemy, but I believe to be like exaltation, to try to raise it or intensify it in some way. Fixation, which is to turn it back into a solid, to be able to make it more resistant to the flames. Solution, as we've already covered, to add in some more water and make it into a solution to help it dissolve. Separation, to take those parts and separate them out, as we said. Conjunction, putrefaction in sulfur, to take that item and put it into sulfur and let it decay there, let it burn there, as it were, right? And decay. Solution of bodily sulfur, to then float it in sulfur so that it would dissolve. Solution of sulfur of white light, to add the white light, which was believed to be like moonlight. Fermentation in elixir to let it grow and bacteria grow in there. Now, what elixir specifically? That's hard to say. Again, possibly the only person that knows for sure is Samuel Norton, right? Multiplication in virtue and multiplication in quantity. Again, we'll get into when we get into multiplication and projection. If you're like, oh, well, these are all just steps you're throwing at me. I don't know, man. It's a lot. Trust me, I know. But I don't know yet which process protocol is using, so I want to cover all of the famous ones. The 7-step version, I couldn't find a name specifically that started this one, but this is, from what I can tell, next to the 4-step, the most popular version, which is calcination, dissolution, separation, conjunction, fermentation, distillation, coagulation, which again, if you've forgotten what those mean, that's okay. I know I just threw up a lot of big words at you. Calcination to burn it, dissolution to dissolve it, separation to separate what's important, conjunction to combine the useful materials, fermentation to let it decay and then the bacteria gives it new life, distillation to boil it and condense it, and then coagulation to congeal it into the Philosopher's Stone. There's also a set of steps that tie into the Zodiac, which is kind of interesting. I'm not an astrologer, yet again, know nothing about astrology, but I wanted to mention this because I feel like it could be important. And those steps are calcination, which is tied to Aries, congelation, which is tied to Taurus, fixation, which is tied to Gemini, solution, which is tied to Cancer, digestion, which is tied to Leo, distillation, which is tied to Virgo, sublimation, which is tied to Libra, separation, which is tied to Scorpio, ceration, which is tied to Sagittarius, fermentation, which is tied to Capricorn and, involves putrefaction, multiplication, which is tied to Aquarius, and finally projection, which is tied to Pisces. And again, we're going to get into projection and multiplication. I know I keep saying that. It's coming. Trust me. The only one of this list that hadn't come up before, there's actually two, but those are digestion and ceration. Ceration is to make it waxy. It's to make a solid that has a soft appearance or like wax. You could add more liquid and more heat to eventually make your solid softer. And then digestion is to modify it with gentle heat. So I just thought that was interesting that those two had come up in the Zodiac version, which hadn't come up anywhere else. Really, really cool. And as I said, though all of these added other steps, they're all extensions of the 4, basically. We've covered all of these in brief. We could have gone into a lot more detail, I'm sure, if I was more studied on these. But again, I wanted this video to actually come out and not take 2 years. Let's move on to the 4, later 5 elements, and the Tria Prima, which is going to be really interesting. The 4 elements were thought to be the building blocks of all reality, as we talked about earlier. Earth, fire, water, air, or wind, and later on, ether is added. Some people call it space, some people call it quintessence. Empedocles called these the 4 roots, and Aristotle believed that the 4 were tied and related to each other, in that fire is both hot and dry, air is hot and wet, water is cold and wet, and earth is cold and dry. Aristotle added ether, or quintessence, believing that while the 4 elements were corruptible, since there had been no change in the heavens, that the stars must be made of a different element. This also makes me think of the 2 halves of the brain. So, one big thing here, too, is Aristotle believed that the 4 elements were corruptible because the earth is corruptible, right? Because things of the earth can destroy each other and there's sickness and illness and things like that. But because the stars hadn't changed, they were incorruptible. And so this last element, this ether, must be vital. It must be special in some way. And that's where the phrase quintessence being used in the Philosopher's Stone comes from. Also, it's really interesting to me from where we sit all these years later, knowing that Aristotle had no way to know that the stars were actually corruptible and were dying in the sky above him, and he just couldn't see their heat death from where he was, right? The time hadn't passed before it got here where he could actually see it. But I just think that's fascinating, that the idea of, well, the heavens themselves are not corruptible because the stars are still there every night, so, must be made of something else. And that something else goes on to be very important because as we see here, Paracelsus, I mentioned him earlier, you might remember, if you listen to the history portion. Didn't. I won't know, but you know. Paracelsus studied the 4 elements and came to the Tria Prima, or the 3 primes. These are 3 materials that Paracelsus believed contained the poisons that cause all disease. The 3 primes are sulfur, mercury, and salt. And Paracelsus compared these to the 3 parts of the human: salt for the body, mercury for the spirit, and sulfur for the soul. Now take that and tie that back into the alchemists before in history that believed that you could just add some mercury and add some sulfur to affect something, and you can see how the dua prima of mercury and sulfur might exist in Magnus. As we know, in Magnus Protocol, they have the dua prima. They don't have salt in there, but salt is still a part of the tria prima, despite heavy criticism from Robert Boyle. Robert Boyle was very against the tria prima, whether that was because Boyle believed it was heresy because it was too close to the Trinity, or whether it was because Boyle didn't believe salt was needed. I can't tell you, but it's very interesting that Protocol has the dua prima and not the tria prima. I mentioned it in the episode at the time. I don't believe that's a mistake. I don't see Jonathan Sims and Alexander J. Newell making that mistake. I think it is far more likely that something happened in the world of Magnus before Paracelsus created the tria prima, and that is why it's just the dua prima there. Or Robert Boyle won the argument in the Protocol world, and so the tria prima was stamped down. Colin mentions that mercury and sulfur have to be in balance. Specifically, he mentions, let me get the exact line here.
Not too much mercury or the world ends, not too much sulfur or we all go mad.
If we have mercury, the spirit, sulfur, the soul, what about the body? But we also know the fears don't need a body, so if the Protocol world is the fears have been bound by alchemy, then why would you need salt? You already have the spirit and the soul. The spirit of fear and the soul of man. You know, it's just something to think about. Next up, let's talk metals and their symbols, specifically the 7 planetary metals, the mundane elements, and the compounds. And we're going to focus mostly on the 7 planetary elements. There are some other elements, the mundanes, the compounds. We're not dig too deep into those, but we are going to dig into the 7 planetary metals. These are lead, which corresponds with Saturn, tin, which corresponds with Jupiter, iron, which is Mars, gold, which is the sun, copper, which is Venus, quicksilver, which is Mercury, and silver, which is the moon. And each of these have some really interesting aspects with each other. We're going to get into all that, but each of these corresponds to a classical planet. It was believed back in those days that any other metals were variants of these metals. And ancient astrology held that each of these classical planets ruled the metal assigned to it. That would mean that the sun had power over gold, while Mars held dominion over iron. Some of the metals, like quicksilver, are still referred to by their planetary equivalent today, Mercury, you know. Paracelsus followed the Hermetic Kabbalan teaching that the 7 planets and their metals were assigned to a vital organ inside the human as well, and I think this could be very important. We have the sun, which is gold, the heart, that's where phrases like a heart of gold come from, we have the moon, which is silver and the brain. We have Mercury, which is quicksilver, and Mercury, which is the lungs. We have Venus, which is copper, which is kidneys. We have Mars, which is iron, which is the gallbladder. We have Jupiter, which is tin, which is the liver. And we have Saturn, which is lead, which is the spleen. I don't know for sure how much of this is going to matter going forward in Magnus Protocol, but I feel like it's kind of important, right? I feel like there's going to be some more ties in here for sure. I wish I went back and listened to it, and I don't remember her ever saying it, but I wish Viola Locke had told us what the locks were made out of in the Locke Museum. I know there's a wooden one, but I wish we'd learned about some of the other ones, because that, you know, just could have had some ties in there. There's also a connection between the 7 planets, 7 metals, and 7 days. With Sunday, and a lot, really quick before we dig into this, a lot of our days are still referred to this way today because of this. So you have Sunday, the sun, gold, Monday, the moon, silver, Tuesday, Mars, iron, Wednesday, Mercury, quicksilver, Thursday, Jupiter, tin, which is Thor's day, right, Jupiter, Friday, which is Venus, copper, and Saturday, which is Saturn, lead. Just something that probably won't ever come up, but might be important. We're going to lock it away in the back of your mind. The mundane elements, and again, I don't think these are going to be super important, but they could be, so I want to mention them anyway. The mundane elements are antimony, arsenic, bismuth, cobalt, manganese, nickel, oxygen, phlogiston, phosphorus, platinum, sulfur, and zinc. And the compounds are acid, sal ammoniac or ammonium chloride, aqua fortis, nitric acid, aqua regia, nitrohydrochloric acid, spirit of wine, which is concentrated ethanol, amalgam, which is alloys of metal and mercury, cinnabar, mercury sulfide, vinegar, which is distilled vinegar, vitriol, which is sulfates, and black sulfur, which is residue from the sublimation of sulfur. A couple of these are really interesting. Cinnabar specifically, for a long time, was our main, and still is in a lot of ways, our main resource for getting mercury, which is really interesting. And the compound used is specifically mercury sulfide. Each of these metals is special, but of them, lead is the most popular in media when it comes to alchemy and the transmutation of lead to gold. You hear about that all the time. That's all the alchemists were trying to do, was turn lead into gold. That's not all they were trying to do. They were trying to do a lot of other stuff. Lead is also the most impure of the metals, but was also known by some as the father of the planetary metals, or the father of all metals. Lead poisoning victims were called Saturnine. At times, lead was confused for tin and vice versa, with lead also being confused for antimony. Tin was sometimes referred to as bright lead, and iron was sometimes called black copper. Iron was said to be anathema to magical creatures or the Fae, and could trap, weaken, burn, or even kill them. The alchemical symbol for iron and Mars is the symbol normally used for man, while copper and Venus have the symbol normally used for woman. These have changed over the years, and sometimes the meaning of them has changed, but that was the original meanings that, as far as my research could find. And you may say, "What? These details all seem really weird." It's just little details about the 7 planetary metals. I think they're really interesting. Quicksilver, or mercury, was believed by many to be the Prima Materia, and that by adjusting the sulfur within the mercury, other metals could be transmuted. According to Aristotle, quicksilver was used by Daedalus to make a wooden statue of Aphrodite move, which is sick. Silver was thought by many to have mystical or magical properties. Casting bullets in silver or a blade dipped in silver could kill monsters. Because of Judas Iscariot, silver is also considered to be tied in with the trait of betrayal through the 30 pieces of silver he took as a payment to betray Jesus. And then finally, gold is the most special, being the most pure. The search for gold by transmutation is what propelled alchemy forward and led to many innovations in chemistry. A couple things I wanted to add in there real quick. Silver bullet, we just have that, right, as a term now, because silver was thought to have mystical or magical properties, and iron being of the earth, while the Fae were of magic. Iron was believed to be able to hurt them, but also because iron had been tampered with, right? It was an alloy, it was a work, it was adjusted. And so it was believed into steel. That was believed to also be able to burn the Fae. Now, why does any of that matter? It feels to me like these things are going to be important because if we're focusing on the 7 planetary metals, which I feel like we are, because that's what the focus of alchemy was in a lot of ways, we have some really interesting ways it could go, right? If we look at the metals and we look at what we've learned so far digging through all this, with earth obviously being tied to the buried, with air, the vast, the water can also be tied to the vast, and water can also be tied to the buried. There's a lot of different ways that it could go out of just the 4 elements, but when we look at lead, tin, iron, gold, copper, quicksilver, and silver, there's a lot of ways that those could tie in as well. Obviously, the moon can tie into the dark, the moon can tie into the lonely, the sun can tie into the desolation, and that's assuming that the fears are still what they were. Now, my working theory is that they're not, that they've been bound by Albertus Magnus and alchemy, or even before that, many years before, by a different alchemist, Paracelsus or Zosimus or any of them. I say before, Paracelsus was later. Anyway, if they're still the same, there's a lot of ways they could be tied in. But if they've changed, I feel like these are the ways they would change, right? Finally, having covered the metals and things that are interesting about them maybe, but also could be important later, we need to talk about the stone itself. We need to talk about some of the other ways to make it and some of the other things that come up from it. Let's talk about the Anima Mundi, or world soul, which is one of the most esoteric parts of esotericism and hermeticism when it comes to alchemy, but also the homunculus. You might have been waiting for the homunculus to come up. We can't talk about alchemy without talking about the homunculus. The Anima Mundi is the teaching that the universe itself has a soul and was created by the demiurge. The artisan Plato thought maintained the universe. Plato called the soul of the earth Orenos, or cosmos, which, we still use the word cosmos today, though Paracelsus called the world soul Archaeus. Paracelsus took this and taught of the macrocosm and the microcosm, where the human is a reflection of the universe around them. I think this is very important with where we're at, because Colin talked about the balance needing to be maintained. Celia talked about the balance needing to be maintained. And I feel like that's going to be important. And speaking of things that Celia mentioned, by the way, just want to throw this out here. She talks about the Dua Prima, the 4 elements, the 7 planets, and balance. So everything we've covered so far, I think, is going to be important moving forward. The 4 elements, the 7 planetary metals, and the 7 planets they attach to, which, if you didn't notice, those 7 planets are pretty important because that's the first 7 planets of the universe, of our solar system, including the sun and the moon, which aren't planets. So I guess the first 5 planets. Anyway, you know what I mean. And Earth is not in there, so it's skipping Earth. But, we'll get back to the macrocosm and the microcosm. I think that could be very important, those 5 planets. So the macrocosm and the microcosm, the human, the reflection of the universe around them, this influenced many things and many teachings. For alchemy could be performed not just on metals and materials, but on yourself and your spirit as well. After all, if one could affect the microcosm, why could one not affect the macrocosm, and vice versa? If one could affect the macrocosm, the world around them, transmutation worked on the world around them, why could it not work on them themselves? This idea, and the writings of Zosimos, came the idea of the homunculus, the little man, or the dwarf in the flask. I have a direct quote here from Paracelsus, and it's kind of disgusting, so just be ready for it. That the sperm of a man be putrefied by itself in a sealed cucubit for 40 days with the highest degree of putrefaction in a horse's womb, venter equitus, meaning warm, fermenting horse dung, or at least so long that it comes to life and moves itself and stirs, which is easily observed. After this time it will look somewhat like a man, but transparent, without a body. If after this it be fed wisely with the arcanum of human blood, and be nourished for up to 40 weeks, and be kept in the even heat of the horse's womb, a living human child grows therefrom, with all its members like another child, which is born of a woman, but much smaller. So real quick, before we get into the next part of my notes, there was a lot of confusion over this throughout the years. Some people got it, for sure, absolutely, and tried to replicate it, right? Some people weren't sure. So whether you were supposed to actually inseminate a horse with a man's sperm into their womb, I told you it got disgusting. How would you easily observe that? Or whether you were supposed to put it in a warm, fermenting horse dung, which is probably more likely because you would put it in a glass, in a flask, to be able to watch it, because he says that would be easily observed. It's still disgusting either way. One of them is less disgusting, I guess, than the other, but it's still pretty disgusting. But then just the idea, I'm going to get really gross here for a second, but just the idea of taking that dung and dipping human blood into it, dropping it in there for 40 weeks, just eventually a child would grow out of it, but it would be a child much smaller than actual regular people. This was just one method of creating a homunculus. Others taught that you used an animal's fluids into its stomach, or a vessel shaped like an animal, which you would then put its guts into. It was taught by some this homunculus was an imitation of the demiurge, and it was thus greatly skilled in the art and creation of all things without needing study or to be taught. It just innately knew how to create art. Some went so far as to say that creating humans through homunculi was the true great work of alchemy, and not the creation of the Philosopher's Stone. In 1775, Count Johann Ferdinand von Kufstein, alongside Abbe Gelloni, supposedly created 10 homunculi that could see the future. And this is one of those weird historical things where there's a lot of people that claim to have seen those. Obviously, when people went to go check, the homunculi were gone. Abbe Gelloni and Count Johann Ferdinand von Kufstein had no good answer as to where they were. Some historians claim that the 10 homunculi died. Some claim that they escaped. There's a lot of eyewitness accounts, though. It's really weird. I'll leave it up to the professionals to break down the mundane metals and compounds. As I said, I don't feel like I have a good enough understanding of how those are used in alchemy, because all the steps I could find involved sulfur, mercury, and things like that, you know? So let's finish this video up by talking about the Philosopher's Stone itself. We've talked about some of the ways to make it. Let's talk about the stone. Some think Adam, the father of man, learned how to make a Philosopher's Stone from God himself. Adam would then have passed it down through his descendants to Solomon. The Hermetical teaching is that Hermes Trismegistus gave the knowledge to man through his writings. Others still teach that some ancient alchemist discovered it, either by science or by studying the stars in the universe. Some teach that man learned the process from angels, demons, or aliens. There are actually two stones, a white stone and the red stone, with the white stone being less mature and an unfinished version of the red stone. The red stone was said to be transparent like glass, but heavier than gold, soluble in any liquid and incombustible in fire. Once one has created the stone, I promise you we get back to this, it can then be used to project and transmute lead or anything else into gold, or to multiply and heal any ills. That's what those terms meant. Projection was to transmute anything into gold, whereas to multiply was to heal or give it immortality. And so the final steps of all the processes of making a Philosopher's Stone were to use it to do other things, to prove it, as it were. Lastly, and in closing here, I have a short list of some of the people who were supposedly able to make a Philosopher's Stone over the course of history. John Dee, we mentioned him earlier. The spy, Nicholas Flamel, Roger Bacon, Jabir ibn Hayyan, Zosimos of Panopolis, Mary the Jewess, Cleopatra the Alchemist. This is not Queen Cleopatra, probably. Medera, Tafnutia, Moses, again, probably not the Moses from the Bible, but and Albertus Magnus. This was a lot. This has been well over an hour and a half recording. I've got a lot of things to cut out from it, but I hope this helps. I feel like, if nothing else, it's an hour and a half of information on stuff that could get brought up in Magnus. The things of this that I think are going to be the most important are obviously the 7 planetary metals, the 4 steps, the 4 stages, and the 4 elements, right? We've already seen what I believe to be the process, the 4 stages, right? Of Nigredo, Albedo, Citrinitas, and Rubedo. When I look back on the earlier episodes, the man that turned into a tree, he was transmuted. He went through the process. It works out perfectly. He even at one point stands in sunlight. It's just about perfect. So whether transmutation is happening by something that happens to people, some process that is started by someone else, or whether it is an internal process that starts within themselves and advances, it's hard to say. There's a lot more to alchemy. I didn't even dig into Rosicrucianism. I didn't even dig into a lot of the extra stuff with Hermeticism, like mind palaces and things like that. I didn't touch on some of the other good science and some of the other bad science, as it was called, right? When it comes to alchemy. But again, I wanted to get this video out, and I don't know how much that stuff is going to matter for Magnus, right? Platoism, Rosicrucianism, Gnosticism, occultism, Taoism, are any of those things going to matter for the grand scheme of protocol? Because if not, there wasn't much point in bringing them up here. But I will promise you this. If they come up later, I will make a follow-up video that goes into all of them. because if it winds up being important, we will do that. But just like this one, it will be a brief dip into it. And I know you might look at this and say, man, an hour and a half, roughly. I don't know how much it's going to wind up being once I cut out all the mistakes and the coughing and the drinking coffee. Man, I love my coffee. Thank goodness for coffee. We're not sponsored by coffee. There's not an individual coffee brand that I even said, but my life is sponsored by coffee. Either way, I think there's some fascinating stuff in here. I'm really interested to see who winds up being important. For this video, I did a deep dive into the Royal Society and into the Fellows of the Royal Society that were also alchemists. There weren't really that many in our world, right, that we know of that were alchemists. There are some, but we don't know all of them. There are definitely famous alchemists that I did not bring up here, just because they didn't come up in the course of my study, but I've mentioned a few of them in the videos, and if they come up at any point, I will bring them up. Hey, Editor Trey here. Two quick things that I forgot to mention that are kind of important and might show up later in Magnus. The first is the shield for the coat of arms for the Royal Society of Chemistry, which is the 7 planetary metals, their symbols. I'll have that up on screen here. And then the second is the squared circle. It's kind of like a big thing in esotericism and in Gnosticism, in some aspects of Christianity, in Hermeticism, and some things with the tarot and witchcraft. And there's a lot of different things that use the squared circle. But specifically, I'll have it up on screen here. In alchemy, it represents the 4 elements of matter and the way they come together with the Philosopher's Stone, right? It is that the idea of any circle finishes in a square, which is a weird thing, but it works the other way backwards too, right? Any square begins in a circle. And if that doesn't make any sense to you at all, the example I mentioned that it can be used sometimes in Christianity, though not in a lot of Christianity. I just want to clarify, it is like a fringe belief, but it's the idea that the womb finishes in the tomb, right? And so the circle becomes the square, and the way that Christianity would apply that is the round stone that covered the square door, rectangle door of Jesus' tomb. That's just one example. There's a lot of other ones, but the squared circle in alchemy specifically is talking about the 4 elements and the way they come together to form the Philosopher's Stone. I just realized while I was editing that I forgot to bring that up, even though it was in my notes, so I wanted to go and throw it in here. Sorry about that. Thanks so much for watching. Hey, like 16 hours later, Trey here. I've been editing the video. It was actually done and was about to go out. I have to redo all the timestamps now, but while I was making the thumbnail, I realized something incredible that I missed before. When I was talking about the squared circle is upside down in the Magnus Protocol, in the OIAR logo. It's right there in the middle. You can see the edges of it. I'll put this back in right after the squared circle section. It's going to throw off all my timestamps. It's going to throw off all the captions. All that's got to be redone. It's fine. That's incredible. I can't believe I missed that before. That is so cool. Anyway, see ya. Thanks. Looking back over the episodes of Protocol, there are a lot of things that could be transmutation, right? The child that winds up becoming a monster, things like that. But they could also just be because of external influence, and it's hard to say. But I do think it's fascinating to remember that a Philosopher's Stone could do basically anything. And if that's true, and somebody like Albertus Magnus did have one, then it could be that he was able to do very different things. Remember that Magnus, I'm assuming Albertus Magnus, exists in this world, and is studying the monsters of this world. Theoretically could have used them as the true Prima Materia to create the Philosopher's Stone, and that could be leading to everything we have now, binding the fears, as it were, these creatures that they had become, whether still the fears or something else. Hard to say, but either way, we're getting some good stuff, and all of this that I've said tonight could not matter at all. I say tonight, who knows when you watch this. None of this could matter come season 2. Or all of it could. There's no way for us to know right now. Some of you lucky people are going to get to hear it early, and then you'll know. Please don't spoil it for me. But and I'll come back to that in a second because I did want to mention that. But at the same time, I'm super stoked, and I really enjoyed studying for this. I still feel inadequate. I feel like I did a terrible job of representing this information, and that hopefully this will help you because it was a lot of digging to get all this stuff, and you could get this same information by doing the same digging, right? Hopefully I've saved you some steps, and hopefully I've interpreted it all well. I tried to just give factual information and what has been said about these people instead of giving my opinion on them, but it was a lot of fun to get into, and if you want a follow-up on this with any questions you might have, please put them in the comment section down below or anything like that. So, a couple last things before we wrap this video up that we have to cover. Season 2, they're doing a digital premiere, which will be on their Patreon. I'm really excited for it. But they've asked people not to share spoilers from it, and it will only be on their Patreon until February. I thus had to make a choice. Obviously, YouTube-wise, it would be a lot better for me to just go ahead and make that video, but I think it would be better to honor their request. First off, because I'm a fan of the show, all told anyway, and second off, because I don't want anybody to accidentally spoil themselves for the premiere of Season 2, which is a huge hype moment, right, on my video. So I'm going to wait to make a video on it until the release in February. That doesn't mean you can't talk to me about it. If you're curious, I am on Twitter and Blue Sky, and you can reach out to me there, and we can talk about it in DMs, or you can message me on Discord. You know, there's a bunch of different ways to get a hold of me, but I'm not going to be making a video on it until it is publicly available. I feel like that is the better thing to do, because again, I am a fan of Rusty Quill. I'm not just a guy that enjoys talking about it. I'm also a fan, and if they ask me, hey, don't do this, I'm not going to do it, you know. The other thing that I'm really excited about that we do have to tide us over is I got this in the mail. The green screen is going to ruin some of that, but if I put it in front of me, you can see it a little bit better. It is the Magnus Archives role-playing game, and super stoked for this. I cannot wait to dig into this thing. It is so cool. So after I've had some time to read through it, and the player guides are back there. Once I've had some time to read through it, I will do a video talking about my favorite things about it, and giving a little like mini review of the book, because it should be available soon for everybody if you want to pick it up. There's also a Protocol board game. I haven't picked that up yet. I couldn't back both, but I backed the Archives one at probably more than I really should have, and I'm really excited for my copy of Mr. Spider and other stuff like that to come in when all that stuff is done. And so I'll probably, you know, show that stuff off when I get it, just to be able to look at how cool it is. But that's I think that's all the housekeeping we have for now. I do want to still do a theory video. I need to do that theory video soon, or I need to just ignore anything that happens in the premiere for the sake of that theory video, because I do plan on watching the premiere. I might wait to watch the premiere until after I've done that video. But either way, I'm stoked. Magnus Protocol has been going in a really cool direction. I'm excited to see where it goes from here. Again, if I didn't cover this well, I am sorry. But please let me know in the comment section down below something that you thought was interesting, a connection that you might have seen to Protocol that I missed. I'm sure there are many. Or if you have any follow-up questions, I will do my best to answer them. Again, I am not an expert. I'm just somebody that was enthused to find connections to his favorite YouTube radio drama podcast. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. And until next time, I've been Trey. This has been The Full Spectrum. Remember to always enjoy the full spectrum. Magnus Protocol has to offer.